Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 652 for the 11th of April 2021. Richard Saunders coming to you from Sydney, Australia. Looks like a sunny day. Happy birthday for yesterday to my niece, one of my nieces. Congratulations to my cousin, who's expecting twins. What would grandma and grandfather say? And no matter where you are in the world, I hope you're having a better day today, a better week, and I hope you got out of the right side of bed on this morning, unless you're sleeping on the floor. Is it easier to get out of bed if you're sleeping on the floor, or harder to get out of bed if you're sleeping on the floor, on a mattress on the floor or something like that? Well, I guess you wouldn't fall out of bed. Well, not very far anyway. Thinking of you people sleeping on the floor. Coming up on this week's show, once you get out of bed, off the floor, we're going to be looking at UFOs, that old favourite, and I think there's one out the window at the moment. Now, Maynard reminded me the other day that it's the 55th anniversary of the famous Westall UFO case here in Australia, where a group of school children in Melbourne saw something strange in the sky. And this story, like the proverbial fish, has grown and grown and grown and grown over the years. In fact, about 10 years ago, there was a very good episode of Skeptoid with Brian Dunning talking about this very case, which prompted me to put Maynard in touch with Brian Dunning and Steve Roberts, Dr. Steve Roberts, the Australian Skeptics UFO expert who lives in Melbourne. They got together the other day to have a talk about this event and other UFO stories from around the world, including one I've never heard about the aliens who make pancakes. So, coming up at the top of the show, Maynard talks to Brian Dunning and Steve Roberts about UFOs. And I think it does us good every now and then to remember the roots of skepticism, which are things like UFOs and ghosts and monsters and psychic powers and all that sort of stuff. Pancake-eating aliens. After that, it's the news from Australian Skeptics, written by Tim Mendham. What's caught his skeptical eye this week? And to round off the show, we once more go into the pages of Trove at the Trove archives and look for references to debunk. Debunk, the word skeptics love and or hate. Included in some of the stories I've found is a really good piece, which I'll link to directly in this week's show notes, about medical quackery, written in the 1950s. Yes, quack devices have been with us for a long time. An interesting show. Any show with Maynard's bound to be interesting. But now it's time for me to run downstairs and feed the cats. Yes, they take priority today. They're a little bit anxious. It's a bit past their breakfast time. What will I feed them, folks? Dry kibbles? Wet cat food? How about some chicken giblets? While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone.
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
Well, people, it's a fairly major event in Australia. One of the biggest UFO sightings in the world, really. Happened at Westall, in Westall 66. It's 55 years since then. I believe I've done the math correctly. And on the line, we have two people who are just really going to school me. Who have we got there? First of all, from America, we have...
I'm Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com.
That's right. Who I first met at the big Skeptic conference there. That was very cool there. We've met a couple of times there. Always good for a laugh there. And in Australia we have...
Steve Roberts in Melbourne. G'day, Maynard.
Hi, yes, Steve. Now, what's your specialty so people know what you're talking about?
Oh, look, I've been following UFOs for about 50 years, ever since I was a kid. And developed skepticism more or less from following them and, and analysing the accounts that we see. The phenomenon's dropped off very much in the last 20 years or so. We'll talk about that. But I'm sceptical of all things, and in the Skeptics I deal with the hard sciences, physics, maths, astronomy, that sort of thing. But yeah, UFOs are kind of ever with us, and when we were younger, back in the 1970s, 1980s, it was a big thing, a big cultural thing.
Well, yes, I'm going to bring up the fact that Westall in 1966, Westall is in Melbourne. Is that far from where you are or not?
It's far from where I am now, but I did live quite close to there about 20 years ago. I do know the area.
And what have you picked up about it locally? I mean, there's always bits and pieces of it coming together. It was basically during a school break, kids saw something in the sky, other people saw things. A lot of people claimed they saw things. It's one of the biggest mass sightings, apart from the aerial one in, I think, Rwanda, which I'm sure Brian will have something to say about there. But it's one of the biggest mass sightings of a UFO ever.
Well, if you believe the account of 200 schoolchildren seeing it, it would be an enormous sighting, and it is a characteristic of most UFO sightings that only one person sees it, and they're often out in the desert or somewhere. But it's very rare to get a sighting where two people in different places have seen the same object and can report it. What we have here is a school with teachers and schoolchildren, and it turns out that only a very small handful of people actually saw this object, but school gossip being what it is, it went all around the school like wildfire. So it's many accounts say that nearly everybody in the school saw it. A couple of hundred kids, and all the staff saw it, and there were police and army and air force turning up afterwards. And I think what actually happened with Westall, the poor headmaster tried to run a school and educate some children, and they're all buzzing and talking about this, and journalists have turned up, and they're being a nuisance and interfering with the conduct of the school. So the headmaster said to the children at assembly the next morning, don't talk to the journalists. So the children then said, we were...
And that's why people thought, there's a cover-up going on.
Yeah, we were told not to talk about this.
Well, the 2 points of information I got this from, the first one's Podcast UFO is the podcast with Martin Willis. He was speaking to an Australian woman about the anniversary of it. And also there is the actual TV show itself, the movie itself, Westall 66, a suburban UFO mystery. I suggest you all have a look at that. Considering that there's not a lot of actual hard data apart from talking to a few people, it's actually quite a well put together documentary for what it is. And what does Brian Dunning think of the whole thing?
Well, I think Steve covered it very well. I mean, it's a very famous story, but the version of the story that's famous is one that has developed over a period of 50 years. The version of the story that existed in 1966, when this actually happened, was far more modest. It was quite a run-of-the-mill UFO story. It was one teacher, and the only number we have is, quote, several. We don't know how many students that is, but a very small number of people. It sounds like you can count them on the fingers of one hand. Reported seeing one object in the sky that drifted off some apparently 400 yards or so distance, drifted behind some trees, and then a few minutes later they saw a very different phenomenon described as this white streak. And the language that's usually given is playing a game of cat and mouse with up to 5 light aircraft, which is kind of an odd concept, but that's the story as it was reported back then. And then you've got to fast forward 50 years before you get the version of the story that's on Wikipedia, that's on the TV shows, that's on all the web articles and podcasts today, which is orders of magnitude larger. 200 students saw this giant thing come and land behind the trees, and one girl went up and touched it, and then government men showed up, and the army showed up. I mean, it's two unrelated stories. So, it's like which story are you asking about? The one that was actually reported, or the one that's essentially the fabrication of decades and decades of entertainment programs.
Well, what I thought was interesting, Brian, was in Martin Willis's show, Podcast UFO, where he was talking to this the person from Westall, who was, there's an anniversary coming up. I think there's a TV show being made about it. And both he and the person was saying, oh, it was great when you do these old UFO things, more information comes to light. And I'm just wondering if that is people remembering things that didn't happen usually. Is that what you've found?
That could be anything. Yes, I mean, it can be that. But essentially every UFO story that enters the public consciousness grows and grows and grows the longer it's out there. And more people, quote unquote, step forward to say that they were involved in it as well. And this involves the full range of human psychology. Some of these are probably honest witnesses who honestly believe that now they remember this too, having heard so much about it over such a long period of time from people that they knew. Oh yeah, I guess I do remember something like that happened. Well, I better call the TV show and tell them that I saw it too. And that can be done completely honestly, with a completely honest recollection of some memory that may or may not have happened. I just run the full spectrum all the way to people who are saying, hey, everyone at my old school is getting famous and getting paid to be on these TV shows. I want to get in on that action too.
Well,
so there's a spectrum of reasons people might want to come forward years later.
Well, if you look at Westall 66 A Suburban UFO Mystery, you'll see in that some hypnotic regression going on, where there's a possibility for things being brought up that might not have happened originally there. But one of the things that was mentioned by the American host was he asked, what are Australians' attitudes to UFO, and are people who are considering into UFOs kooks or not? What do you think, Steve? I think we're pretty open about it.
Yeah, we are. But this one is significant because it's one of our UFO sightings. This with my Australian hat on. At the time this happened, I was living in Britain, and in Britain we had this feeling that all the best UFO sightings are happening in the USA, and most of the abductees are 80% are American, and can't we have our own UFO sighting here? When somebody did see a UFO in Britain with a spectacular story and a photograph and so on, it was big news because it was our UFO sighting, and I'm sure Australia down here, they would have felt they were missing out until they had their own UFO sighting. We've only really ever had two. We had this one, another one in 1993, which is also a very dubious origin, but those are the two UFO sightings that would come to mind if the topic cropped up in Australian conversation. Supposing you were a kid at the school, not one of the kids who saw the UFO, but just a child who attended the school, and then, your parents and your Uncle Fred would ask, did you see the UFO? And you say, no, but Jones from year 7 saw it. You'll do the best you can to be part of the sighting. And frankly, Westall's an extremely boring area. It's heavily industrial. There's factories and stuff driving around. Not many people live there, and not much of interest really happens in Westall. So this would be the thing. If you said Westall in conversation, even now, I think this story would come to mind in the Australian culture.
Well, I think there's two kinds of sort of public perception of the UFO phenomenon. Number one is UFO, actually what the yellow letters stand for, unidentified object, where sometimes you'll turn on the news at night and you'll see that there was some great big fireball that flew over the city and everyone saw it. Maybe it was a meteor, maybe it was a rocket stage re-entering, something interesting like that. In my experience, there's never really been any kind of a stigma over talking about that. I mean, that's something that you could bring up freely in your office the next day. The other kind is more of what we're really talking about, which is this belief that aliens are actively visiting the Earth and the government knows about it and is covering it up. That is something that has been fringe and marginalized and closeted for most of history. But really, sort of over the past decade, with the worldwide rise in populism, it's become more mainstream to be open about conspiracy theories and beliefs that the government is actively trying to subvert the citizens. That's become more mainstream. And so whereas you wouldn't have heard someone bringing that up probably even 5-6 years ago, you would be very likely to hear someone just introduce that into conversation out of the blue. So there's been a shift.
Look, one of the things I find interesting that's been that normally goes along with the UFO or UAP phenomenon is a bit of high strangeness goes on. There's always a bit of strange, odd things either going around or being reported by people at the same time. Was there anything around Westall 66 that was odd, Steve, at the time? Did they see odd things that were not related to this phenomenon?
No, I don't know of any other stories of similar things at the similar time or place. It was a event that stood by itself, and the belief being held in the 60s was just a sort of general belief that there might be some secret projects going on. I mean, everybody knows the military does have secret projects, and people would flatter themselves by thinking that Moorabbin Airport, which is 4 miles away from the school, might be a place where secret military flying machines are being tested, but it's actually a very mundane place, and it's extremely unlikely there'd be anything of military interest at Moorabbin Airport.
Because Brian, you as the Mr. Stiff Shirt Skeptic, you went through the original papers and everything of the time, and what did you find, Mr. Stiff Shirt Skeptic?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what I said at the top of the show, which is that the initial reports were fairly limited in their scope, and they didn't include anything like girls fainting and having to be taken away. These are all things that were added in much later versions of the story. Obviously, if something like that had happened on the day, that would have been the most dramatic thing of the day, and it absolutely would have been in the newspaper. So that's the kind of thing that I look at and say, well, I think we can be relatively certain that part of the story did not yet exist, or it would have been reported. So I think it was just something real happened. A few people did see something that they didn't understand, and that in itself is fascinating and interesting, and that's enough of a mystery for us to research. Where it becomes difficult is when the media tries to amplify it and turn it into something that they find is going to be much more sensational and make much bigger headlines. And it makes it so much harder for those of us who actually want to find out what really did happen.
Well, of course, you're going to report the story in the most sensational way possibly. And I do see on your Skeptoid page, Mr. Dunning, you have a drawing at the top with a proper flying saucer and birds fleeing in terror from it.
This is typical of a lot of. I've actually reported on a number of historical UFO stories over this past year.
I've got a good one for you in a moment, Brian. I'm going to give you a big glass of shut up juice in a moment. But go ahead. I've got one for you in a moment.
Okay, great. And a lot of these include drawings made by the children, and it turns out that these drawings were made by the adult version of the children 35 years later, after having been told this UFO story over and over and over countless times over the decades.
Oh, well, also for the Westall 66, a suburban UFO mystery show, they had to, the drawings they made for that were black and white drawings like school children had done as well in that style. And I think considering what they had, and they didn't have any footage to show, no photos to show, they did quite a good job with the documentary. But there's just no solid evidence, unfortunately, to hook the whole thing on. But I want to bring you Wisconsin, Brian Dunning, Wisconsin, Eagle Creek, Joe Simerton, the UFO pancake incident. Do you know anything about this? The 60s pancake incident.
This is not ringing a bell. I may know it by a different name because famous UFO stories kind of have different names.
Well, you look up Eagle Creek, Wisconsin, which is nowhere near you, is it, Brian?
No, quite far.
Okay. Well, Joe was actually sleeping in his kitchen, and a UFO flew over his house, landed in his backyard. He got up and knocked on the door of it, and there were aliens inside making breakfast. They asked him for some water, which he gave them. They appeared to be making pancakes. They gave him physical pancakes, which were then tested. And if you listen to him talking about it, he seems very puzzled. He doesn't seem like a hoaxer. He doesn't seem like a guy who's particularly having an odd moment. It's just that's a classic bit of high strangeness. He actually had the pancakes, and it was taken away by the Air Force and was analysed, and it was found to be pancakes.
I think it's very rude to be served pancakes and to not eat them, but instead save them so that they can.
Well, he said the alien pancake, they just they didn't taste that good. They were a bit cardboardy, but they needed water off him. And I'm just going, was this a lurid dream he had? Or it was, because if he was having a hoax, it wasn't a particularly good one, because as he's talking, he seems very puzzled by what happened to him. And I just find that a very classic bit of high strangeness that makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, how come they ran short of water? You think they'd have enough water on board to make coffee and so on?
Well, yeah, they had like a griddle going. They were doing that kind of thing. I just thought it was a very odd thing, and that makes me think that sometimes this phenomenon is all about the person rather than something external sometimes. I'm just throwing that out there.
I would agree with that. I mean, without having researched the story, I mean, I can give you what my initial thoughts would be. It would tell you where I would start to investigate and try to learn more about what actually happened. My experience is that people lying or making something up or hoaxing is very rare and plays a very small part in almost all UFO stories. I believe most people who identify as eyewitnesses are sincere in their belief of their memory of what happened. And as we know, human memory is the most fascinating subject that exists on the planet. And the way the brain works and the way the brain interprets its inputs and comes up with its interpretations of what's actually happening around it, it is an absolutely fascinating topic, and it's a huge topic. So what would have led this person to come up with that memory of what happened to him? If he shows up with the Air Force Base and he's got a handful of pancakes and he hands it to someone and says, "Test these, please."
Oh, and by the way, the remains of them are still at Edwards Air Force Base. Martin Willis has actually seen them. They're in a display case saying these were tested and found to be pancakes. So, yes.
Because I can get to Edwards pretty quickly. I have to go see that. Yeah,
it's somewhere near the mess hall or something like that. It's actually there with a whole bunch of stuff they got under glass. It's like, here's the UFO thing we had. But look, just off the subject for a moment there, what do you think of Travis Walton's experience, Brian? And what do you think, Steve?
Yeah, this is a difficult case, and I think it is a standout in that it is probably one in which the entire thing was knowingly and deliberately fabricated with a for-profit motive. I think that's extremely rare, and I don't want to cast aspersions on the larger UFO phenomena by associating the Travis Walton story with other stories. I think it's quite clear, though, from all the years of evidence and interviews and even the lie detector tests and the way that they were misreported, I think it's very clear that there was very little honesty going on in the stream of information from these two brothers. And we do know that they had a large financial motive with the cash prize from the National Enquirer. So I hate to even waste time talking about that because I don't think it deserves a spot in legitimate discussion.
The only reason I mention is because I met Travis Walton when he was in Australia, and to me it seemed like someone that something had happened to. His eyes sort of, he just reacted when I mentioned the whole thing. But I also spoke to, Joe Nickel? Is that the skeptic investigator?
I think he's one. Robert Schaefer is another one who does a lot of UFO work.
Yes, because Joe thinks that that he was faking the whole thing and based on his experience as a detective. But when I was interviewing Travis, I thought something did go on there, but I couldn't tell what it was. But something happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, remember that he has based his entire career, every waking minute, on this story conceived in the 1970s, and at that point, you were going to be so practiced in this narrative that you've been developing that you are going to believe it yourself. And you are going to take it personally when someone seems to disbelieve it. So nothing about the way that he would behave or present himself would surprise me.
One of the things that was great at the paranormal conference we went to, and we don't have many in Australia, they happen quite often in the US and elsewhere, but they don't happen very often here. It was at the Blue Mountains. I went with Richard, and they had people put their hands up, anyone who's experienced a close encounter the first time, first kind, second kind, third kind, fourth kind, and then there was the fifth kind, and there was like a couple of hands up, and I think the fifth kind is if you are impregnated by an alien. Is that the fifth kind? Is that where you're melding DNA? Is that what that is? Am I correct, Steve or Brian?
I forget the actual list, but the third guy was alien contact. There's been no fourth or fifth kinds I can think of.
Yes, and there were people with their hands up, and at that point I would have gone, stand up, tell us your story, but it was just like a simple survey, and of course Richard was being his stiff-shirt skeptic thing and writing very words down, and I was going, well, that's really interesting over there, and Richard was like, anyway, yeah, but it was good to go to those things. I just wish there was more Have you been to many paranormal conferences at all, Steve? Because we don't have them in Australia. What about you, Brian? Are you welcome, or do they show you the door and give you the wet broom treatment?
I have not been to one, but I have friends who go to them regularly, and I like, it's like this was the year I was going to start going to all of them, and then of course COVID hit and I didn't go anywhere. But I'm really hoping to start going to a few.
Yeah, I've been to a couple. There's an enormous commercial element, people flogging books and stuff and making money, and the UFO fans who go along, their leaders are very egoistic indeed. But they're all there dying to hear stories and so on. And people who have had experiences have shown enormous respect. And it's almost worth cooking a story up to get that respect. You know, you'll be ushered into the room and given a special seat. And the room will go silent when you come in out of respect for you and so on, if you're a victim of a UFO event and so on. But I went to one conference in London when I was living in Australia, and there's 400 people there. The speaker told this tall story about UFOs over Sydney, which they all lapped up, the audience. Ooh. And I was the only Australian there, and I thought, well, shall I pipe up? And if I did pipe up, they'd all just shout me down, you know. But this whole story was a tissue of lies about something that's meant to have happened in Sydney, which is so far away from British imagination that anything could happen there. They wouldn't be able to check on it. So I think a lot of these things... I did go to another presentation. It was a very sorry affair from a man who thought he'd built a flying saucer, but he hadn't actually quite got around to actually building it. So all we saw was a one triangle of some angle iron bolted together that morning. And he never quite finished the flying saucer, but he reckoned it would work if he'd built it. There's a very sad kind of thing to attend, really.
I know we're running short of time here. What about the Canada one, of the underwater one that seemed like something crashed into the water and went out into a bay there? What about that Canada one? Come on. Canada's Roswell, or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. That's such a skeptic thing. Everybody sample that. Yeah.
I need 5 minutes to refresh myself on that, though.
Yeah, that's fine. But yes, look, we're running out of time here. Steve, your last words from you?
Well, yeah, it was a great social phenomenon of the 50s and 60s, and it died the death when everybody was carrying a camera around with them. It was fun at the time.
Well, look, thanks, guys. Great having a chat to you. Great having even though you are a party pooper, Brian, great chatting to you, and Steve, great having a chat to you as well. Look, I said that Reframing the Debate's a good book to have a look at for that side of things. The podcast UFO, The Source of Life, the Westall 66, The Suburban UFO Mystery, and of course, Skeptoid, if you want to really ruin your fun.
Thank you.
There was someone who said you should rename the show, Well, Actually.
I agree.
I saw a UFO. Well, actually.
And I will old-splain, white-splain, mansplain all of these urban legends to everyone.
Cool. And for all those overseas listeners, if there's an Australian band you want to get into, I would recommend Hiatus Coyote, spelt with a K. Hiatus Coyote. Bit of jazz and hip-hop all mixed together. I just thought I'd throw that in. As well as the 2020 Iceland Eurovision entry. Fantastic. Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com, also known as Well, Actually. And also, Steve, thank you very much for chatting to us in Melbourne there. And go out and have a bit of a wander around, because you can do that in Melbourne now.
ただいま聞いていただいているポッドキャストはオーストラリアから The Skeptic Zone という科学と論理のポッドキャストです。英語は世界中で数ある言葉の一つですが、このポッドキャストはいろいろな 国の言葉で紹介します。www.skepticzone.tv を調べて、ホームページの下までにスクロールすると、折り紙のピガサスという翼のある豚を工夫したリッチャード・ソーンダースのオリジナルの折り紙のポスターをダウンロードをすることができます。
Now it's time for the Australian Skeptics Newsletter, newsletter number 120, written by Tim Mendham. Hi all, it says. In among the news of some interesting practices by the Alt-Med Brigade, there are some truly inspiring pieces on how science works and the public attitude towards it. Read on, Tim. And don't forget, when you subscribe to this newsletter, all these stories are accompanied by a link. Misty Mountain Health Retreat loses charity registration. Retreat associated with band and naturopath Barbara O'Neill loses its charity status. The body responsible for the revocation won't say why, but a positive result nonetheless. Push for the investigation into Scientology's charity status. According to an investigation by The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, the Church of Scientology has shifted tens of millions of dollars into Australia from offshore and is making significant tax-free profits. Australia, the investigation found, has become, quote, an international haven for the religion, despite a sharp fall in its numbers of local adherents, end quote. Australia's belief in the supernatural. Based on a survey of 1,000 people, 48% of Australians say they believe in ghosts, or at least the possibility that they may exist, while 69% say the same for the soul. Apparently younger people are stronger believers than the old, and women stronger believers than men. Anti-vaxxers promoting fake insurance document. The anti-vax pseudoscience promoter, Ellie Salznon, has posted a supposed product disclosure statement from Allianz Insurance on her Facebook page, which states that the company would not cover negative side effects of COVID vaccines. The document is a clumsy fake, but that doesn't stop Salznon and her followers from gushing conspiratorially. Salznon comments that, quote, "You literally can't make this shit up," end quote. Someone obviously and literally just did that. Says a lot about anti-vaxxers' gullibility, rush to judgment, and deviousness. Anti-science movement is escalating. Scientific American puts the anti-science movement on a par with terrorism and nuclear proliferation as a threat to global security. Quote, "Rejection of mainstream science and medicine has become a key feature of the political right in the US and increasingly around the world," end quote, it says. Quote, "Anti-science has emerged as a dominant and highly lethal force, and one that threatens global security as much as do terrorism and nuclear proliferation. We must mount a counter-offensive and build new infrastructure to combat anti-science, just as we have for those other more widely recognized and established threats," end quote. Forceful stuff. 6 tips to help you detect fake science news. If the science sounds too good to be true or too wacky to be real, or very conveniently supports a contentious cause, then you might want to check its veracity. A handy list to keep at hand. Doctors, and that's in little quotes, doctors dispute COVID-19 information. A curious piece out of a Californian student newspaper. Ostensibly a news report on a couple of chiropractors demonstrating their deep medical qualifications and knowledge on vaccination and immunology. It quickly ends up being a refutation of them point by point. More power to student journalists. We also have a list of upcoming events from around Australia, including Queensland Skeptics, Canberra Skeptics, Adelaide Critical Thinkers in the Pub, Vic Skeptics Cafe, Gold Coast Skeptics, Perth Skeptics, Sydney Skeptics again. Well, we are busy here in Sydney, and more. And that was just some of the items listed in the Australian Skeptics Newsletter. You can sign up and have that newsletter delivered to your inbox about every other week. Just go to www.skeptics.com.au.
Hey, fellow skeptics.
Ben Radford here,
With Celestia Ward,
your friendly host of Squaring the Strange,
a podcast that looks at topics ranging from legends, panics, and cryptids,
to media myths, psychology, and folklore.
breaking things down and picking things apart.
As we skeptics do.
We bring a few different perspectives on things.
Celestia, for example, is a witty cartoonist.
And Ben is a brilliant writer and longtime skeptical investigator.
We don't always agree,
But we have fun trying.
and we learn new things.
Join us for new topics every week or two.
Or browse our backlog of evergreen episodes.
Available on iTunes and all your podcast feeding troughs.
Squaring the Strange.
Take care, strangers.
Bye-bye.
It's time to wander once more into the pages at Trove at trove.nla.gov.au, the online resource of magazines, periodicals, newspapers, journals, all digitised and searchable. Australian news and information going back decades, indeed centuries. And this time I thought we'd look up a term that comes and goes in favour with skeptics. Some people hate it, some people think it's appropriate. The term is debunk. Now, as James Randi would often tell us, that skeptics are not debunkers. We don't set out to debunk something. We investigate with an open mind. However, I think it's fair to say that once something has been investigated and shown to be false, conclusively, then the word debunk might be appropriate. Certainly in the popular imagination, the word debunk is, whether we like it or not, applied to skeptics. So we pour through the archives at Trove and we come to the Sunday Times from Perth, Western Australia, an article published on the 10th of October 1948. Scientists debunk popular beliefs. Whenever scientists look into popular sayings, they come up with some amazing results. For instance, experts who have measured hair under a microscope have found that the average growth day by day between shaves is the same as the daily growth when people don't shave. And those who declare that lightning never strikes twice in the same place will be interested to know that the New York's giant Empire State Building is often struck during severe storms. And there's the idea that powdered glass is a dangerous poison. Actually, it is not as bad as the writers of thrillers would have us believe. The powdered glass delusion goes back to the times when arsenic, a deadly poison, was manufactured in the form that looked rather like glass. Idea that a person who fell from a very high building or from a plane would be dead before he hit the ground is incorrect. During the war, many flyers fell a mile or more before their parachutes opened. They remained perfectly conscious and landed unharmed. But those rheumatic pains do forecast a damp spell, for changes in atmospheric pressure have a real effect on rheumatic joints. Oh, those scientists debunking popular beliefs. And strangely enough, on the very same page is a giant ad for Dr. Sheldon's gin pills for the kidneys. Ouch, it says. Relieve dragging pain of backache, rheumatism, joint pains. Rid your system of excess uric acid. And our next port of call is the Adelaide Advertiser, published on the 10th of July 1947. US scientists debunk flying saucers. AAP and our special representative. The text is a little blurred over the years. New York, July the 9th. The theory of Professor F.S. Cotton, Professor of Physiology at the University of Sydney, that flying saucers were an optical illusion, is supported by prominent American scientists. Dr. Henry Garrett, Columbia University, said, "Under strong enough suggestion, you can cause a man to see anything you want him to see." Dr. Jesse Sprouse, Professor of Psychology at the University of Maryland, agrees with Professor Garrett that there is absolutely no limit to the delusions a mind can harbour. Some scientists believe that a number of people reporting the discs are simply exhibitionists who want to attract attention to themselves. Dr. James Hamilton of San Francisco agrees that the discs are probably a psychological phenomenon and points out that the scientists even have a name for it. Muscovolitans, which translated means flying flies. Medical officers attached to the United States forces in Germany are equally skeptical. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwin Schultz says that those seeing the discs are affected by an entropic phenomenon which causes a person to see disc-like objects moving swiftly out of the field of vision. It is experienced, he says, when one looks fixedly at a bright light. The columnist Walter Winchell cites examples of similar phenomenon being observed as long ago as 1893 by the commander of HMS Caroline when steaming through the China Sea. Tending to favour the suggestion that the flying discs are a new secret weapon, David Dietz gives them a possible Australasian origin. Dietz says, "Not until a few weeks ago, when Britain knighted a New Zealand professor, did we learn of a secret Anglo-American research during World War II. All we learned then was it represented a weapon said to be comparable with an atomic bomb in death-dealing efficiency. We know that this professor previously worked in the field of electroradiation, and it is easy, although perhaps incorrect, to jump to the conclusion that he has protected some sort of electric ray." Dietz draws support from known characteristics of radar rays. He continues, "It is not over difficult to imagine that some way may have been found for focusing and reconstituting such electronic radiation. Such concentrated energy striking a cloud might cause an electric reaction which would result in some bright object." The belief that the first flying saucer had been found on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico, was dispelled when a Fort Worth Army airfield officer identified the object as a ray wind target used to determine the direction and velocity of high winds. Ooh, that's an interesting one, a report about Roswell, and that comes from 1947. And here's one from the Herald, published in Melbourne on the 7th of January 1952. A very short article. 8,000 scientists debunk, predict. Herald Special Service, New York, Sunday. Scientists at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science debunked ideas that women are the weaker sex or redheads are hot-tempered. Noted that a nation's birth rate decreases as its consumption of pig iron increased, and predicted that within 10 to 20 years synthetics would replace half the wool now used, and that new drugs might enable the deliberate moulding of people physically and mentally. Now here's an interesting one. The Herald 1947. From Monday the 3rd of November, the Melbourne Herald. and something I might have mentioned on the show before. In fact, I probably have, the story of the Piddingtons. Now, the Piddingtons were a husband and wife performing duo who had a mentalist act and made it huge in England at the time, although originally from Australia. And they would regularly draw millions of people into their radio program, where they would do mentalism. Some years ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, I had a conversation with the president of the Australian Psychics Association, the late Simon Turnbull, who was of the opinion that the Piddingtons did have real psychic power. I tried to explain. Anyway, this one comes from a column called Today's Information Guide, Radiolog, the Herald Radio writer. Piddingtons try to debunk skeptics. The Piddingtons use wires under the studio carpets and tiny microphones in their ears to get miscellaneous results from their 3KZ mental telepathy show, according to some skeptical critics. The Piddingtons will use their half hour from 7:30 tonight to debunk these and other explanations, which some listeners have advanced to prove the show is phony. And it sort of reminds me of people, possibly scientists, possibly reporters, possibly just made up as a red herring, when Uri Geller was bending spoons saying, he probably uses lasers coming from his belt buckle or acid on his fingers. Sometimes the trick is far simpler than that. And finally, here's one from the World's News, published in Sydney on the 7th of February 1953. Quack Health Machines That Kill, by Peter Denton from New York. Reputable medical men debunk them, but gullible customers still buy cures. Quack medical men in America no longer sell bottles of coloured water guaranteed to cure everything. Instead, they sell cure-all gadgets. The medical profession is alarmed at the number of people being killed by these machines, either because they are quite useless or dangerous. In Melbourne, in 1948, a man was jailed because he was hawking small metal plates supposed to cure rheumatism. The plates, made for about 6 shillings each and sold for £1, were worn in the sufferer's shoes. They were said to convert the human body into a walking electric battery. And I must pause here, folks, to say there's nothing new under the sun. My goodness. This is like reading something that I've been investigating over the past decade, not from the 1950s. This could almost be written for the power balance of some years ago, or various quack machines we still see today, made for very little, sold for a lot, and don't do any damn good at all, apart from placebo. We read on. But this man was an amateur compared to some American quacks. The American Food and Drug Administration has uncovered some startling cases. One syndicate bought up thousands of tons of war surplus equipment: dials, batteries, transformers, tubes, lenses, instrument panels, switches, buzzers, and coils. They converted this material into impressive-looking health boxes. Because legitimate doctors are using electric devices, a great deal of this sort of imposing paraphernalia gives the quacks an advantage. One gadget investigated by the Food and Drug Bureau was the diabetes machine, known to have killed at least 100 people because they forsook their orthodox treatment for the quack instrument. It cost about £300 and contained a dry battery, a small bulb, and a coloured glass panel. One of the most spectacular frauds was the spectrochrome, an invention of a supposed Hindu calling himself Dinsha Framji Gadali, who wrote letters purporting to denote 12 degrees after his name. The spectrochrome was a garish, lighted jukebox affair, supposed to cure every ailment from major diseases to blisters by correcting the body's chromatic scale. And I'll pause once again to say, yes, nothing new under the sun. This is amazing. I find this personally quite fascinating. This is the same sort of bunk which is going on today. There we are. I'm using the word bunk. We read on. The patient first discovered the most propitious day and hour for treatment with the favoscope supplied free with the machine. Then he would lie with his head to the north, while yellow, magenta, red or green light played on the affected part of his body. The spectrochrome could not be bought, but for a fee of £50, a patient could join an institute and have his colour imbalance corrected. When authorities seized a number of the gadgets, they were found to contain nothing more than an ordinary light bulb, a lens, and half a dozen coloured plates made from ordinary window glass. Gadali was fined £4,000, which he paid in cash before leaving court. I'm sure he did pay in cash. These machines can really rake in the money. That wasn't in the original, I just added that. Let's read on. Another operator sold a £50 radioactive pad, ideal for female complaints. It is estimated that he sold 20,000 of these things. Investigation showed that the pad was simply a piece of steel, wrapped in felt and covered on one side with micra. An expensive item, the radio gland rejuvenator, costing £500. The salesman explained to the gullible customers that the profits on this was practically nothing, as the makers were only out to do good to suffering humanity. It was expensive, yes, but so were the materials used. One end of the gadget was attached to an ordinary radio. The other was passed over the glands. All it did, investigators found, was to create static on the radio. It cost about £2.10 to make. A firm, supposedly reputable, advertised vapour baths for £900, which included cost of installation. The bath relieved diabetes, lung abscesses, blood poisoning and other diseases. Its active ingredient was naphthalene, or in other words, mothballs. Reputable scientists reporting on the high-priced baths said, "It is not entirely a fraud. It does give the user a thorough moth-proofing." These expensive cures did not sell in great numbers. They do not need to in order to make their owners a fortune. But one firm went for a killing with a gadget called an electrete, priced at only £8.10 each. The firm operated for 3 years until closed recently, and sold 24,000 electretes, said to cure goiter, kidney trouble, childbirth paralysis, deafness, broken bones, and heart pains. It turned out to be a battery-operated device which imparted a mild electric shock. There is no end in sight to these frauds. Wow. I wonder, no, the writer could never have possibly imagined that 70-odd years later that would still be true. That's amazing. There is no end in sight to these frauds because there is no uniform legislation throughout America's 49 states. Banned in one state, a racketeer can go to another. Some states have no laws dealing with the matter, and an operator can practice openly. No amount of publicity and advice from responsible medical authorities seems to deter people from buying these useless machines. Some shady firms spend thousands of pounds a year in advertising, using testimonials of people long since dead. Often their deaths have been caused by the very gadgets they are supposed to recommend. The magazine Hygeia, official organ of the American Medical Association, said recently, "Perhaps we ourselves should invent a gadget for curing people's gullibility." And there we'll leave it, and I think that was one of the most interesting articles I've stumbled across in looking through the Trove archives. Interesting because it is as true now as it was in 1953. Quack medical devices made out of flashing lights and bits of machines, promising lots of different cures and delivering ultimately nothing. And we only have to look to recent reports of the so-called biocharger flashing light cure-all machine promoted by, as we say, former celebrity chef Pete Evans. So there we are, some more interesting results from our search through the archives at Trove, trove.nla.gov.au. You might wish to spend an interesting couple of hours yourself trawling through those archives. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone, and thank you to those people who continue to support the show at Patreon, PayPal, by visiting skepticzone.tv and clicking the link. And thank you to those people who are looking through my collection of photography at the bottom of that page. And if you feel like purchasing one of my digital prints, that money goes also directly to helping the Skeptic Zone podcast. And thank you to Brian Dunning and Steve Roberts for taking out time a few days ago to talk to Maynard. In fact, the whole session lasted about 3 times longer than what you hear, but those three were clowning around so much and having so much fun, it was pretty hard to chop that down to something I could use on the show. Now, this Tuesday night here in Australia, you can see me give a talk at the Canberra Skeptics online all about the Great Australian Psychic Prediction Project. Just visit canberraskeptics.org for details. And that project's going very well at the moment. In fact, we've cracked the big 300 barrier. In other words, we have less than 300 predictions to go through, mark and score, although I might be weeding out a few here and there, taking a closer look to see if we can put some aside, because we have well over 3,000 catalogued already, which I think in anybody's book would be a decent number to publish. And by that I mean publish the analysis, the results. Nevertheless, we'll plough on for a few more weeks, I think. And in regards to that, I notice that the latest edition of the Psychics Directory has come out with an article about why predictions are wrong. I better give this a good solid read. And it was this very publication, the Psychics Directory way back, which prompted me to start this whole project, because they used to publish their yearly predictions, what's coming up for the year ahead, which I would mark at the time, which are incorporated into this huge project. And their hit rate was not spectacular. But I better give this article a read, because one of the paragraphs here is headed, Channeled Message from Nostradamus for 2021. On that thought, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Well, it's good to see you, Michelle. Really,
thanks. I'm glad.
You haven't been on the project for a while, and before. No. And I know Adrian has to go at some stage or other. So before we get stuck back into the predictions, and we're talking about Sophie Monk at the moment. Anyway, folks, I've got the regular prediction project group together at the moment, and I thought it would be a good opportunity. Susan Gobeck's not here, which is a pity. But why don't we do the dice game? We'll do the dice game. Look at this. It's a nice green one. Look at that.
We're not going to use the Susan dice, which since she's not here, that would really irk her if it came up 555.
It's a little difficult to toss around that dice. That die. Anyway, so everybody, it's out of 10. Let me hear your predictions.
8.
7.
4.
4.
I'll represent Susan. I'll go with 5.
All right. Michelle?
8.
8. Here it. Yep, here it comes. The first roll is 4.
I always do 4. See, damn Susan.
Adrian got that one. Okay, next one.
Adrian and I both got that.
You're psychic.
Yeah, next one. What do you
We're
say?
lucky.
2.
Mhm.
6.
I'll stay
3.
with 4. I'll stay with 4.
4.
3.
Here it comes. 4.
Yes.
There we are, holding it up. Okay. Last one. What do you say?
4.
Ooh,
5.
5.
5.
2.
2. Lots of 5s coming in. Here it comes. Oh, it fell on the floor. Actually, it's just by the cat. Hang on. Come here.
Do we count it then?
I don't know. Sorry, I got it back again. Here we go. Okay. I wish I could just pick it up and show you without touching it,
Is
because
it 4?
it is indeed 4.
Wow.
And I never make this up because it's always random and always fun. Folks,
Well,
today's
I
winning
think
number.
I've been on the paranormal thing too long now. I'm doing it.
4, 4, 4. Shall we do one
That means
more?
we're going to be very unlucky.
Yes, I think so. One last one. Here it comes.
Well, you know what I'm going to guess.
10.
10,
4. What the hell?
4,
9.
9, says Michelle. All right, here it comes. I don't believe it. No, it's not 4. It's 1.
Oh.
Well, okay, today's winning numbers are 4, 4, 4, and 1. Thanks, everyone. And you say,
Yay.
You'll have to remove the silence.
I'll remove the silence.
So if you add the 1 to each of the 4s, it's 555, and Susan wins.